The Australian Financial Review.
Last week, in a small ski town high in the Swiss Alps, bankers, consultants, tech executives, mining bosses and politicians gathered for a high-powered meeting.
I'm walking along the promenade of Davos. It's a very small town, but never does it get more crowded than it does during the week of the World Economic Forum.
The annual meeting in Davos is a chance for the global elite to discuss and debate the state of the world. But it's also a massive networking event.
As I walk along, I'm now walking past the Meta Pavilion. Of course, Mark Zuckerberg's not here yet. He was at the Trump inauguration. And one thing about this Davos, the Trump inauguration has completely overshadowed it.
This year, Davos kicked off on the same day Donald Trump was sworn in for a second time, and the US president was the talk of the town.
My administration has taken action to abolish all discriminatory diversity, equity, and inclusion nonsense, and these are policies that were absolute nonsense throughout the government and the private sector. America will once again become a merit-based country.
In the past, Davos has been used to spruik companies' progressive credentials. But with Trump's attack on DEI this year, there was a different vibe.
When I talk to clients here this week, I'm sure you've heard this to the point of just nausea, cautious optimism. It's just, if I hear that one more time, we're cautiously optimistic. No, you're terrified of what's coming.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. Today, Europe correspondent Hans van Leeuwen on how companies and governments are responding to Trump 2.0, whether diversity programs are under threat, and why Australians have stopped going to Davos. It's Thursday, January 30. Hi Hans, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hi, Lisa, and greetings from the Swiss Alps, from Davos.
I know, it's great to get you on the ground in Davos at the end of a big week. You've been rubbing shoulders with the rich and powerful. Set the scene for us.
Imagine a sort of small ski town, but for most of the year it's just families taking a chairlift up the mountain and skiing down. And then suddenly, in the middle of January, something like 3,000 participants, all who've paid quite a lot of money to be there, descend on the town for the World Economic Forum's annual gathering, which for the rest of the year is a think tank based in Geneva. But every January they hold this gathering where CEOs, politicians, civil society leaders, and the odd sort of American rapper will get together to hold panel discussions about the issues of the day, test the waters of the year ahead, swap notes on what's happening in their industries or their sectors, and most importantly, network.
Who were the big names there this year?
Well, the American bank CEOs, the Wall Streeters, they're always there reliably, and so normally most of the major tech company heads. And then you get a smattering of politicians. It used to gather more. This year we still had Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor. China always fields somebody, and this year it was Vice Premier Ding Shuixiang. Javier Milei from Argentina comes. There are a few sort of heads of state from Southeast Asia, South Africa, and then you get the glamour edge, which this year took the form of David Beckham, the footballer, and will.i.am.
Aha. So most of the big American CEOs were there, but what about the Australian contingent? Who was there from Australia?
I've been coming to Davos for about 5 years, and over the course of that time, the number of Australians going to Davos has sort of shrunk noticeably, and I think it hasn't gone unnoticed by the World Economic Forum organisers either. There was no government minister this year. It's been a long time since the Prime Minister went, but normally the Trade Minister or the Finance Minister goes because there's often a sort of ministerial gathering like that. But I think in an election year and with cost of living at the front of everyone's mind, that probably the government thought it wasn't a very good look to send someone to a kind of elite gathering in the Swiss Alps. And the number of CEOs going has also diminished. This year there was only 3. There was Andrew Forrest from Fortescue, who always goes and is quite a larger-than-life presence here. Wesfarmers CEO Rob Scott and South32, the mining company, Their CEO, Graham Kerr, was also there. I think the thing is, it sort of happened after the pandemic. So when Australia sort of shut its borders in the pandemic, the one after that, almost no Australians went. And I think it just sort of got a lot of people out of the habit. So most of the Australians you see here, a lot of them work in America or in Europe. And people like Matthias Cormann, the former Australian finance minister, who is now the head of the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development, or Julie Bishop, another former cabinet minister who was here wearing a sort of United Nations hat.
Hans, for journalists who go to Davos, it's all about getting the vibe. So what was the vibe like this year?
Well, every second participant's experience of Davos is different than the person they, walk past on the street. This makes it difficult for me as a journalist to kind of throw a chapeau over that whole diversity of experience. But I've got to say, it was made a lot easier this year to take the temperature because of Trump's inauguration.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
Almost every conversation I had started with a, so, what do you reckon?
President of the United States.
I'd expected to see more people, because we're talking about there are a lot of sort of liberal cosmopolitans in this group, and I thought I'd hear more we will fight on kind of talk from those sort of people. But most of what I found was people saying they were cautiously optimistic, or even just genuinely optimistic about the Trump presidency. But not everyone was like that. I met Dan Tannenbaum, who's a partner in Oliver Wyman's risk and public policy practice, and he wasn't buying this cautiously optimistic line.
When I talk to clients here this week, I'm sure you've heard this to the point of just nausea, cautious optimism. It's just, if I hear that one more time, we're cautiously optimistic. No, you're terrified of what's coming.
Tannenbaum is a risk management practitioner, so he's very familiar with gauging the unknown and the uncertain. And he did say that the uncertainty was making it difficult for companies to plan and to strategize.
It's basically everyone's bracing for the unknown. And that is not a great feeling when you've had such globalization for so long and a fear of broader fragmentation off the back of a new U.S. administration, which there's so many mixed messages. We're going to tariff China. I'm going to visit China. We're going to make a trade deal. Which is it? It makes it very hard for businesses to really chart a path forward with this kind of uncertainty.
I heard the same thing from Helen Zhang. She's a former Australian diplomat who founded the independent media company International Intrigue.
But I think there's also a sense of anxiousness and uncertainty hanging over the participants about the next 4 years and what a Trump administration might bring. And whether, that means that the death of globalism or a decline of globalism and multilateralism. But the vibe is still here. People are still out on the promenade.
So sometimes I heard optimism and excitement. Sometimes I heard uncertainty and caution. But whichever it was really all about Donald Trump.
Hans, you said before that you've been to 5 Davos forums, and typically this forum tends to provide a platform for companies to announce and champion progressive policies and causes. But given Davos is all about Trump this year, and Trump has in effect banned diversity policies from his own government, how different was Davos this year and the approach to those more progressive policies?
It was a strange one because normally the tone is set by these big declarative statements from the World Economic Forum about what the challenges of the year are, and you get a lot of panels about environmental sustainability issues and climate change and, encouraging diversity in the workplace. But Trump's first day in office with all those executive orders just completely overwhelmed that sort of agenda-setting effort that's made here at Davos. And so the week was much more sort of reactive rather than proactive. One of his first executive orders was on eliminating diversity, equity, inclusion, or DEI programs in US federal government departments. That became a big talking point. Are these DEI programs just sort of, onerous tick box exercises that companies don't want to do, or are they things that do genuinely promote better corporate culture and more effective and better working companies? The World Economic Forum has a sort of history. Its kind of roots in the early 1970s when it was founded was as a sort of attempt to kind of define European sort of stakeholder capitalism and that kind of corporatist sort of model of social democracy, and kind of I guess, rope the Americans into it. For many years, the Americans, have come here every year and they've sort of bought into that to some extent. You'd see someone like Mark Benioff from Salesforce announcing a program to plant 1 trillion trees, or one year the meeting started just after BlackRock's Larry Fink had written that letter saying that environmental, social and governance issues, ESG, were now a kind of driving force in his organization. So you do find the World Economic Forum trying to instill a certain liberal, progressive orientation within the American freewheeling, free market sort of Wall Street culture. But I think this year, a lot of that kind of WEF agenda got slightly pushed to the side by that more American mode of thinking about capitalism, that the deregulation and free markets and the kind of unleashing of animal spirits. That meant that we saw a bit less of companies standing on the parapet and saying, we're committing to this, we're doing this, we want to make the world a better place.
Hans, Trump did address Davos via video link. Talk us through his speech and how that set up the corporate and geopolitical agenda for the year.
Well, it was a very Donald Trump experience. And for those of us that haven't seen Donald Trump in full presidential mode for 4 years, it was a return to a movie we've definitely seen before. He spoke very quickly through the first half of his speech, and it left me wondering whether maybe the teleprompter was running a bit faster. He sounded like he was calling a horse race at various moments.
Okay.
But that aside, it was a big counter through not just his views on geopolitical issues, but also largely a kind of recitation of his executive orders, the greatest hits of his first presidency, and a kind of series of rather punchy messages on what's to come. So top among those, I guess, was the foreshadowing big tax cuts for companies and putting tariffs on those who don't accept his invitation.
My message to every business in the world is very simple. Come make your product in America, and we will give you among the lowest taxes of any nation on earth. But if you don't make your product in America, which is your prerogative, then very simply you will have to pay a tariff.
So after telling us that you should come to America because the economy is going to boom under him, he said that people already were coming to America and walking through the door with their wallets wide open.
And just 2 days ago, Oracle, SoftBank, and OpenAI announced a $500 billion investment in AI infrastructure. Other companies likewise have announced billions and billions and billions, adding up to trillions of investment in America, in the United States.
And so what was the reaction to all of this?
Well, his speech came almost right at the end of Davos, weirdly. But all through the week, people were reacting to the constant drumbeat of announcements and interviews and press conferences that Trump was doing back in Washington. I spoke to a lot of people and a few comments stood out. I asked John Ferguson, who's a London-based Australian with the analytical firm Economist Impact, about how companies were planning on dealing with Trump 2.0. And he was in the cautiously optimistic camp.
I think everyone's trying to understand what the future holds, but trying to talk to each other. There's also some cautious optimism that we can get through some of the worst cases of some of the more outlandish things that Trump says.
He said that after we've had a pretty wild ride in the past half dozen years or so, companies are probably up for the challenge.
I think the business executives here at Davos have been through quite a tough 4 or 5 or 6 years, and they're prepared for disruption. I mean, we've had COVID, we've had the war in Ukraine, and now we have another Trump version 2. I think people are just ready for disruption. And I think they are reasonably confident, maybe that's a Davos thing, but they're reasonably confident they can get through it.
Ahead of Davos, you wrote that the meeting would be the litmus test for Trump 2.0 and whether it would trigger a shift in global corporate culture. So what's the verdict? Do you think that Davos gives us any indication about whether there is going to be a shift?
I thought I'd see people saying, no, we believe in this DEI, ESG, and we're going to keep doing it. But overall, a lot of the comments that sort of came through publicly or the way the sort of thing bubbled to the surface, it felt like the strongest impression I was getting was that people were pretty happy to see a reduction in red tape, green tape. But I think there was also probably quietly people just either waiting to see and seeing how this all pans out and how serious it is and what it entails and what kind of competitive advantage or disadvantage you might get from doing one thing or another. And others who are still just going to stick to their knitting and go on doing what they're doing, but perhaps send out fewer press releases about it or do fewer drinks receptions to sort of tout their sustainability credentials or their diversity policies. I mean, for some companies, this stuff is still essential. I spoke to a few mining executives while I was here. If they have a project in the US and the Trump administration says you don't need to worry about all that, red tape that's been holding you back, we'll just sort of rip all that up and you can go in and you can start digging. They still need to get buy-in from communities that live near those mines. Even if the rules are different, the social requirements are still there. And what's more, even if you then just sort of thought, yep, you know what, I can just do what I like in the US, in Alaska or wherever it might be, anything you do in that jurisdiction will be watched by people, affected communities in other countries, and the expectations and the rules might be more stringent in those countries or more exacting. And you don't want to get a reputation for being someone that as soon as the rules are off, you just sort of let rip.
You need that social license.
Yeah, that's right. And so, if there are global reputational consequences from embracing this sort of anti-woke agenda and you're a global company, the gloves might not come completely off.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, all that said, whatever decision you're making or whatever pathway you're contemplating as you go forward, what Trump does and says is going to condition the decision you make and the space for action you have. So in that sense, Trump's definitely in the driver's seat.
Hans, we're talking about Davos and whether there is a shift in global corporate culture underway, a move away from progressive environmental and social policies to a more hands-off approach. While some companies are resisting, some businesses are embracing this new world order under Trump. Which companies have signed up and what are they doing?
Well, one of the most visible or vocal recruits to the Trump deregulatory agenda is probably big tech. And that's not very surprising because tech's been under attack all around the world. They're facing new regulations, including in Australia, where the Albanese government is planning to force tech firms to pay new taxes unless they strike deals with the Australian media companies to pay for news. And they're planning that ban on social media apps for children under 16. Trump's, unlike his first term, actually, when he had a more ambivalent attitude towards big tech, he's really sticking up for them this time and saying, he's going to take the shackles off, in terms of regulation. And the companies have responded.
Hey, everyone. I want to talk about something important today because it's time to get back to our roots around free expression on Facebook and Instagram.
Mark Zuckerberg from Meta has performed this extraordinary U-turn on fact-checking in Facebook and Instagram.
First, we're going to get rid of fact-checkers and replace them with community notes similar to X, starting in the US.
And has put the kibosh on his company's DEI programs.
I'm looking forward to this next chapter. Stay good out there, and more to come soon.
It was all sort of crystallized when you saw that lineup at the inauguration. Tim Cook, Jeff Bezos, Sundar Pichai, and Sam Altman, all there near the front row somewhere watching Trump get sworn in. It felt like a sort of seminal moment, and it was definitely noticed in Davos, particularly because they were all there and normally they'd be at Davos. And then, of course, there's Elon Musk, who's, almost single-handedly brought this whole deregulation agenda right to the front of American and world minds. He wasn't obviously going to go to Davos. He claims it's boring.
Mm-hmm.
So at the same time, it's not just the tech people. We've seen Walmart, Ford, McDonald's all retreat from their DEI policies. That hasn't rippled out to Australia quite as much. As readers of the Financial Review will know from the past week or two, companies are less willing to sort of talk about what they're doing, either to defend their positions or to suggest that they're retreating from them.
You mentioned Elon Musk. He's having an outsized influence at this stage on the administration. There's lots of speculation about whether the relationship between Trump and Musk will survive. But if it does, how much do you think Elon Musk will dictate US policy on corporate regulation?
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation, isn't there, as to whether there's room at the top of American politics for two such large and publicity-attracting egos to work together. I mean, so far, the bromance has continued. But I think in sort of more practical terms, it's hard to quite picture where Musk's primary focus will be. His formal remit under Trump is to cut superfluous sections of the bureaucracy. But how far does that go? Is he really just there to cut the DEI programs and reduce the headcount, or is he going to get involved in all aspects of what counts as red tape? I mean, is it prudential regulation, financial stability? That stuff's less sexy, but it really matters to companies and to the functioning of markets. The only one I think you can be absolutely sure of is he'll have very firm opinions on, regulating tech and the policy around the tech industry. And we've already seen that. One of Trump's first big announcements was that $500 billion for AI infrastructure with Sam Altman from OpenAI and Oracle's Larry Ellison and SoftBank's Masayoshi Son. But Musk came out straight away and said they didn't have the money and sort of questioned it. Obviously, everyone seized on that as a possible sort of moment of schism between Musk and Trump, but the water flowed quickly under the bridge there so far.
And Musk has also had a lot to say about your neck of the woods. He's taken on both Keir Starmer and Nigel Farage in the UK, and he's promoted the far-right AfD party in Germany. What's happening there? His position in world politics is certainly unprecedented. Is he having an impact?
Yeah, again, it's an interesting one. He sort of singled out a couple of countries in particular, and the question is why those ones. So he's been extremely critical of the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer over a number of sort of hot-button issues, including terrorist attacks and the treatment of certain people on the far right, like Tommy Robinson, and the sort of grooming gangs scandal that's been sort of floating around in the UK for many, many years. In that sense, he seems to be driven by a genuine interest in British politics and Britain, which is a common feature among Republicans, actually. His second sort of most keen interest is in Germany and the prospect in the February election of the Alternative für Deutschland, which is a pretty far-right party there. So there's some thought that his motivation for picking on those two countries in particular is that those two countries have possibly the toughest regimes on social media use in Europe. And so there's a kind of underlying agenda to put those governments on the back foot so that he can work towards getting those regulations changed in those countries. But Musk is only sort of part of a broader interest by the MAGA Republicans in fomenting a more populist, anti-woke agenda in Europe and supporting all the parties in Europe who cleave to that agenda. That's been going on for quite a few years, but mostly under Steve Bannon, who is another sort of Trump acolyte, but one who has a very difficult relationship with Musk. So it'll be interesting to see how it develops, because Musk could potentially find a way to put money behind it. And Steve Bannon has long been putting organisation and thought into this. But he's got his many companies to run. And he's got this Department of Government Efficiency that may become a bit more of a focus for him in the months ahead. Particularly as both the person he was supposed to run it with, the politician and entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy, and the person who was supposed to execute these plans, the lawyer Bill McGinley, have both left the department in the past week. But you can be sure of one thing: as long as he has Trump's ear, he's going to have very significant input on all fronts.
Finally, Hans, we had the headline last week, "Has Trump killed DEI?" So after a week at Davos with the rich and powerful, do you think he has?
Well, Lisa, it's a very good question, and it's a hard one to answer. And I'm going to slightly cop out and say I think it's too early to say whether Trump has killed anything. He certainly landed a heavy blow on the DEI agenda, and companies are going to have to take a good look at themselves now and say, well, have all these policies achieved in my company? Are they in my economic or commercial interest, or was I just doing them for nebulous or intangible reasons that weren't actually serving my customers and other stakeholders? So it's going to prompt a debate, and it's going to prompt a big change of heart in some companies, and possibly a reaffirmation and a more firm trajectory for others. But what I would say is that because it's such early days in the Trump administration and there's so much water yet to go under the bridge, it's just too hard to say which view will prevail and to what extent. And beyond that, there's a lot of hubris in the air this week. Trump's just been elected with his majority. He's just been sworn in, and it feels like we're at the sort of very peak of a political wave. These political honeymoons, these kind of zeniths or apexes in the politician's arc, they never last forever. I'm not a young guy anymore, and I've seen this movie before. They come in, it's all triumphant, and there's this tendency to think that the political moment we're in is now a sort of permanent revolution and things will be like this forever. But tides change and fortunes shift. And so who knows where we'll be in 1 year and 4 years' time.
So where will you be in a year? Do you think you'll head back to Davos for a sixth time? Is Davos still relevant?
Well, look, there's a whole side to Davos that we've only really touched on briefly in this discussion. It's not just a moment to sort of take the temperature of geopolitics. It also has this tech strand, particularly in the last couple of years on artificial intelligence. We're in the middle of an extraordinary tech revolution, possibly, I think it's the sort of sequel to, but much bigger than, the arrival of the internet, even, and the smartphone. And Davos is a place where that does get talked about. It's a reason why a lot of people come here. And Trump himself seems to be someone who has some kind of affection for Davos. He's been before, and he said on Thursday he'd like to have been there this time, but his inauguration got in the way. So if he comes, then everyone else will come, including the political leaders who've been in slightly shorter supply in the last year or two. I mean, as for me, I'm in a similar boat. There's always a story to be told here at Davos. I wouldn't be surprised if next year, with 12 months of Trump under our belt, and Trump possibly even here in the Alps, it could be a very interesting place to be.
Thanks, Hans.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Europe correspondent Hans van Leeuwen reporting today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow and Lapfan. Fiona Buffini is the executive producer. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to The Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.